welcome back to Free Speech Nation. In 2019, Bev Jackson and Kate Harris, along with some supporters, formed LGB Alliance, a registered charity which aims to support the rights of lesbian, gay and bisexual people. Of course, many of us are now accustomed to longer initialisms, such as LGBTQIA+, and so a charity focusing just on the LGB was immediately interpreted by some commentators as being anti-trans. Since then, the group has been the target of defamation and hostile attacks from activists and ideologues who are seemingly determined to misrepresent the group's aims. But LGB Alliance is growing nonetheless, and this week it announced that it had received a national lottery grant for a new helpline for young LGB people. And I'm delighted to say that Bev Jackson and Kate Harris join me now in the studio. Welcome. So let's begin with your background, because I know you both come from a gay rights background. You've both been very active in the movement. Do you want to tell me a little bit about what you did before all of this began?
Well, I'm so old that I was one of the founding members of the Gay Liberation Front in the UK, in London, at the LSE in 1970. And I was 19, and I went on our first march, which was in November at Highbury Fields in 1970, and I was chosen because I was one of the 5 steering committee. I was chosen to be the spokesperson, and I just really remember that day that the journalists gathered around me to say, what are you going to say about this march of homosexuals? And I asked them, what paper do you come from? News of the World. Oh, well, And then I went around to them, mostly from the tabloids, and one man said, I'm from the Times. And I said, oh, this is really embarrassing. But anyway, I said, hello, Mr. Times. Well, and I gave some garbled speech from my 19 years of ignorance. And the one quote that ended up in the article, which you can look up in the Times in November 1970, was, it's important to know that we are not ashamed to be homosexual. And for years, after we'd made so many strides with more social acceptance, I thought, God, that was a timid thing to say. It's important to know we're not ashamed to be homosexual. But now I find, 50 years later, I have to come out of retirement to say exactly the same thing that I said then.
This is a really important point, I think, because, of course, back then, 1970, we didn't have equal marriage, didn't have equal age of consent, all these various things. There was still so much social stigma, and it would have been very brave to do what you did then. You similarly were involved, Kate, with Stonewall, I believe.
Yes, my background was very, very different to Bev's, which was brilliant because we didn't know each other three years ago. But her background was Gay Liberation Front. My background was Women's Liberation, Women's Aid, etc. I made the wild move into a really boring corporate job, and I worked for American Express for many years. And at that time, I got involved with Stonewall. I loved Stonewall. We all loved Stonewall at that time. It was so well respected. Everything we did was about building bridges. It was about fact. It was about reason. It was about love. And it was also about accepting disagreement, but saying, we are homosexual and we would like to have the same rights as everybody else, even if you don't like homosexuality.
Sure.
So I brought it into my workplace. I was at American Express. Very involved with the Workplace Equality Index, the Diversity Champion Scheme. In fact, I wrote a short article for the Times this year saying we created a monster. Once upon a time, Stonewall represented freedom of expression, freedom of thinking, the ability to disagree. And now, sadly, that has all changed.
So I've invited Stonewall onto this programme many times, and their mantra is no debate.
Exactly.
This has been a turn that has happened over the past 5 years. And they're now very much about the notion of gender ideology.
Yes.
And, of course, most people don't feel they have a gender identity. That is a very particular thing. So can I come to you on this, Bev? Because I've been shocked at the rise of openly homophobic remarks that I've seen online, some very vicious homophobic things, often from people who propose gender ideology as a thing. So what's going on here? And why are Stonewall failing to address it?
Up until 2015, Stonewall was an LGB organisation. It promoted the rights of LGB people, of originally was against same-sex marriage, but then came on board with it and played a good role in achieving same-sex marriage. And then it found itself, perhaps in 2015, without much left to do, and decided it had to embrace a new mission. One new mission it could have embraced, and I think perhaps it should have embraced, was to fight homophobia around the world, because there are still 69 countries around the world that criminalise homosexuality. That's something that we really ought to be fighting against. And they had another choice, which was perhaps more lucrative, I don't know, and that was to promote gender identity. And I think it's really important to say it's about gender identity, because every time we talk about gender identity, it gets into the papers as new trans rights row. It's not about trans rights.
So, I mean, because you've been described as anti-trans, an anti-trans hate group by some commentators. I mean, how do you respond to that? Well, I mean, do you have a problem with trans people and their rights?
Well, of course not. I mean, lots of trans people support us. And we were called a hate group from within 12 hours of us having our first meeting, on the basis that we were called LGB Alliance, which was just a throwaway. I remember when I said to Kate, should we, I don't know, it's about sexual orientation, should we call ourselves LGB Alliance? And she said, well, we could do that. We can always change it later. It was absolutely not a decision to leave out anything. It was just we felt there was a new need to fight this homophobia that you were just talking about.
It's very confusing to me, though, as well, that to say that because you're an LGB charity, that you are being exclusionary. But trans rights was never part of your remit to begin with. That wasn't something you were focusing on sexual orientation.
Well, lots of organisations are focusing on trans rights, and they have every right to. Why shouldn't they? We have a pluralist society. And for those people who do have a gender identity, which is something that, you know, we don't have and lots of people don't have, they have every right to represent those people. But we represent different people who, just as the people I represented in 1970, are attracted to other people of the same sex. But in order to be that, you have to accept that there are two sexes. And as soon as you say, oh, hang on, there aren't two sexes, no, what we've really got is a gender, and there's an infinite number of genders, and some people are not any gender at all, and then you can't, basically haven't got homosexuality anymore.
So this is a key point, isn't it? Because I'm just going to bring you in here on this, Kate, because Stonewall, on their website and in their promotional materials, have redefined homosexual as same-gender attracted.
Yes.
But, of course, that's not what it means. It means same-sex attracted, and actually a recognition of the biological reality of sex has been at the heart of the gay rights movement forever, really.
Yes.
So when LGB Alliance came about, so what was your thinking? I mean, had you tried to engage with Stonewall in those early days?
Yes, it's quite interesting. As thankfully the debate has developed, people say, handy tip, why don't you speak to Stonewall? We go, oh. And as I said, Stonewall was in my DNA. Blood, sweat and tears at my civil partnership. My partner and I said, no presents, please give money to Stonewall. So believe me, I was very loyal and very supportive. But we started to develop an unease with the leadership of Stonewall. And when I say we, I mean a number of different people were involved. Many former trustees and I held meetings and we discussed, what can we do? We can't possibly be critical of Stonewall. And we ended up saying, after 2 years, where I was responsible for writing to the head of trustees at Stonewall to say, could we talk? Could we get former trustees to speak to existing trustees? Could we get a mediated discussion? All these letters went on over a period of 2 years. And at the end of it, it was clear that no debate was the rule. And that was when I was introduced to Bev. And we'd never met before, but we realised, because lots of people in the LGB world had said, we don't know what's going on. Why is T being slapped on? Where about sexual orientation, same-sex? T, equal rights and respect to T people, but they believe they want to live as closely as they can to somebody of the opposite sex. I can't see any relationship between that and being attracted to somebody of the same sex.
So it's this conflation of sexual orientation and gender identity,
yes,
as though they are naturally the same thing, and of course they're not. I suppose What you could argue is that, well, both groups face marginalisation.
Well, so do so many other people in society, people with disabilities or refugees. But there is so much difference between people who are attracted to others of the same sex and people who have some kind of a problem, I think, with their identity. It's just such a separate issue that it's very unfortunate that these things have been stuck together. And you hear, for instance, on the BBC, you hear people talking about LGBT relationships. What on earth is that? Or an LGBTQ person has been... Who is an LGBTQ? It's not helpful to put all these letters together.
Well, also, I mean, so many gay people I know, in fact, I don't know any gay people who feel that Stonewall represents them anymore. So there's clearly a sense that there's a need. But where do you stand, though, when people say... I mean, I've heard critics say, there's no need for a charity for gay people anymore. We've got equality. We've got it all now. Why do we need this now?
Well, we need it particularly now because a lot of gay and lesbian, especially lesbian teens, are now being persuaded that they are really the opposite sex. I mean, in the 1950s, if a supposedly effeminate boy, he might be teased and told that he was like a girl, which was a horrible thing to say to a boy. It made him feel really awful. And these days, if you have a boy who's quite effeminate, he's told that maybe he is a girl. I mean, how is that progress? It's called progressive. It is not progressive. It's the most regressive doctrine I think imaginable.
I also want to just bring in here the fact that the homophobia that we see now is the worst that there's ever been. And that's because this thing called gender identity ideology is like Japanese knotweed, and it now is through all the mainstream media, all the universities, all the NHS, all the government departments. We're very, very late in fighting back. Now, what worries us and what keeps me awake at night is that as a child, I was David. I know as a child, Bev was William. And I can promise you that if I was 12 now, I wouldn't be going to a therapist and saying, I think I might be a boy. I would be saying, I am a boy. I need puberty blockers now. I need hormone therapy. I need to have a double mastectomy when I'm 18. And I would have ignored everything about, you will be sterile, you will have no sexual feeling for the rest of your life, and you will be on medication. And the thing that drives us is we're fighting against the conversion therapy bill because it's a mask. So much of this discussion, for those who don't know, trans rights is used as a veil. Take back the veil and you will see what we see as a regressive and homophobic ideology that says you can't just be a kid. Our thing is let every child grow up to be what it wants. Let every child go through puberty.
So my understanding is that most children who have feelings of gender dysphoria, that is resolved through puberty in any case.
Yes.
And that gender nonconformity within children is a reliable predictor of being gay in later life.
Exactly.
So effectively you have a situation where gay kids are being told that perhaps they're straight, they're just in the wrong body.
Yeah, I mean, this is really horrifying, isn't it? When you look closely, what you see is that gay and lesbian teens are being medicalised. And if they go further, they take cross-sex hormones and they have their breasts removed, and because it's 3/4 of them are girls, they find at the age of 25 or 26, and we hear more and more of these every day, what have I done? I've got beard growth, I've got a deep voice.
And they're a deep transition as a result.
I wasn't trans. I was so convinced. And they feel guilty because they were really convinced. They tried to convince everybody.
So for the sake of the minority who are gender dysphoric and who in later life will transition, we are effectively, potentially transitioning or putting kids onto a pathway to transition when they're not trans at all, they're just gay.
Yes, and in Scotland it's even more horrific because the government, despite the majority of the population saying they are against this, are trying to push forward with what they say is a progressive piece of policy. We say it actually, and I'm going to say this on television, you can go away and think about it and read about it, but to me, it's the end of the Enlightenment. Because don't forget, a lot of the main Enlightenment, most important people were from Scotland. And in Scotland, they're saying you can change sex when you're 16. can you change sex? No. B, do you know if... I mean, you're not allowed a tattoo when you're 16. So we're really worried about what's going on in Scotland, and we're campaigning hard for that legislation to be withdrawn.
So talking to you now, I mean, everything that you're describing seems eminently reasonable to me. And even if I fundamentally were to disagree with your points of view, I don't see any reason why we couldn't sit down and have that conversation. And yet, I see commentators in the media, very prominent people, calling you hateful, bigoted, fascist, far right. I mean, how can you...
Well, what's happened is that what was once the gay rights movement, which I was proud of and which I think has achieved lots of things, has been kind of subsumed into the transgender movement, which says sex isn't important and everybody has their own gender and children know from an early age what gender they are. And we are disrupting that narrative. People used to be afraid before LGB. I think LGB Alliance has played an important role, and I hope that's not just a feeling of self-importance, because before we came along, people who opposed the idea of gender identity were told, oh, you're being homophobic, because all the gay organisations everywhere were LGBT. They were LGBTQ or LGBTQIA, whatever. And it was homophobic, and people were afraid. They had been told, and they believed, that the push for gender identity was the new civil rights, the new step in the civil rights movement, and they thought, oh, you mustn't oppose that, that's homophobic. And then we came along and they said, sorry, actually, there's lots of people, lesbians and gay men and bisexuals, who don't agree. And so we disrupt the narrative, and that is why I think that we are called a hate group and all these unpleasant things which are, it's difficult to live with. But
you can see, for anybody who's not aware, please look up Allison Bailey. Just the name. It's Allison, Allison Bailey. Look her up on Google. Tomorrow is a summing up of the Employment Tribunal. Allison Bailey is, in fact, one of the most extraordinary cases of the 21st century. She tweeted about our existence the night we formed. And since then, she has been vilified. And I probably shouldn't say too much because the case is ongoing, but please follow it in the newspapers.
And this is a black lesbian?
This is a black lesbian barrister who's overcome the most extraordinary difficulties to get to where she is. And she is suing Stonewall, who should be supporting her, and she is suing the chambers with whom she was associated.
So, I mean, we don't have time to go into that now, but I would still advise people to look into her case, and particularly because a lot of it came about because she tweeted in support of you. But you are going from strength to strength, and you have a conference, I believe, at
Yes, we're very proud of that. This will be our second annual conference at the QE2 Centre in the heart of Westminster. And we had a very, very successful conference last year, and people found it inspiring. And the man who ran the projector at the back said it was he ran conferences all the time. It was the only one he'd ever found interesting. And
but can we also say that it's open to everybody? LGB Alliance is an LGB organisation, and contrary to some of the commentariat, we are largely run by lesbians and gay men.
Yes.
Where we welcome support from anybody, whether they are straight, whether they are trans, whether they are LGB. What we look for is people who have open minds, who are prepared to discuss issues. And to me, that is the heart of liberal democracy. And what I'm so frightened about is we are the canary in the coal mine. Because if we don't speak out, it's the lesbians particularly, and that's why I encourage you to look at the Allison Bailey trial, employment hearing. It's the lesbians in particular who are being told to be quiet, have sex with men who think they're lesbians, because otherwise you'll be transphobic. This is hard to believe. I do realise that. This is very hard to believe or to understand. But this is the truth of what's going on. And it's the young children, the young girls, who are the most vulnerable in society, who are getting the sharp end of an ideology that we think is not only regressive and homophobic, but we think it is cruel in the extreme, and it will lead to the biggest medical scandal of this century when we look back at all the girls who've had double mastectomies, who've had hormone treatment, all the boys who've had penis removal. This is unnecessary surgery on a generation of children, and the people who are promoting it, in 20 years' time, where will they be? What will they be saying?
Well, I think it's very important that we have the dialogue wherever various people stand on the issue. So thank you so much, Bev and Kate, for joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you.